The intelligence reports arriving at Imperial Japanese Naval Headquarters in early 1942 painted a picture so ridiculous that senior officers openly laughed when reading them. Canada, that frozen dominion clinging to Britain like a dependent child, supposedly posed a naval threat in the Pacific theater. The analysts described Canadian vessels as little more than fishing boats with mounted guns, crewed by lumberjacks and farmers who had never seen combat. One commander dismissed the entire Canadian naval presence with a wave of his hand, calling it the Frozen Navy, a joke that spread through the officer corps like wildfire. The contempt was total, the dismissal complete, and the consequences of that arrogance would prove catastrophic. Yet something in those same reports should have triggered alarm bells for anyone reading between the lines. The Canadians had been building their naval capabilities since 1939, transforming from a token force into something far more substantial. Their Royal Canadian Navy operated across the Atlantic with growing effectiveness, escorting convoys through submarine-infested waters where German U-boats prowled relentlessly. The vessels may have started as converted merchant ships and outdated destroyers, but the crews manning them had been forged in the crucible of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. These were not inexperienced sailors playing at warfare, but veterans of brutal convoy actions where one mistake meant death in freezing waters. The Japanese leadership remained blind to this reality, focused entirely on their stunning victories across the Pacific. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were crumbling, and the American fleet still reeled from Pearl Harbor. In this atmosphere of triumph, the idea that Canada could mount any meaningful resistance seemed absurd. The naval architects in Tokyo believed their technological superiority would crush any opposition. Their torpedoes ran true. Their ships were faster. Their crews were trained in night fighting techniques that had proven devastatingly effective against every opponent they had faced. What could a frozen navy possibly do against such perfection? This fatal underestimation stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of warfare in northern waters. The Japanese had built their entire naval doctrine around tropical and temperate operations, optimizing for the warm waters of the South Pacific and Southeast Asian archipelagos. Ice, freezing fog, and the unique challenges of Arctic and subarctic combat were foreign concepts to commanders who had spent their careers preparing for carrier battles under clear skies. The Canadians, by contrast, had spent centuries mastering these exact conditions. Their fishing fleets had operated in the Grand Banks through centuries of storms and ice. Their merchant marine had learned to navigate waters that could kill an unprepared sailor in minutes. The stage was set for a collision between contempt and competence, between theoretical superiority and hard-won expertise. When Japanese strategists looked at maps of the North Pacific, they saw empty ocean dotted with insignificant islands and ice fields. They failed to recognize that these frozen wastes could become weapons in the hands of those who understood them. The Canadians knew something the Japanese had yet to learn. In the northern seas, nature herself would fight on the side of those prepared for her fury. The frozen navy was about to teach the Imperial Japanese forces a lesson written in ice and blood. The transformation of Canadian naval power began not in shipyards but in the cold Atlantic waters where survival itself demanded constant innovation. While the Japanese enjoyed early victories in warm Pacific waters, Canadian sailors were learning brutal lessons, escorting convoys through waters where U-boats lurked beneath every wave. These convoy runs taught skills that no peacetime training could replicate: reading weather patterns in minutes, coordinating rescue operations in freezing darkness, and maintaining equipment in conditions that froze oil and snapped metal. Every crossing built institutional knowledge about operating in extreme cold, knowledge that would prove invaluable when attention turned toward the Pacific theater. As 1942 progressed and Japanese expansion reached its maximum extent, strategic thinkers in Ottawa and London began considering how Canada could contribute to the Pacific campaign without abandoning critical Atlantic responsibilities. The solution emerged from Canadian geographic advantages. The nation possessed both Atlantic and Pacific coastlines, with naval facilities on both oceans. The small but growing Pacific fleet based in Esquimalt had been relegated to coastal defense duties, but these ships and crews represented an untapped resource. Plans were drafted to gradually shift more capable vessels to the Pacific as new construction and American support freed up resources in the Atlantic theater. The vessels that would form the backbone of Canadian Pacific operations were an eclectic mix, reflecting the Navy's rapid wartime expansion. Corvettes, those small anti-submarine vessels that had become the workhorses of Atlantic convoy escort, began appearing in Pacific ports. Tribal-class destroyers, among the most powerful ships in Canadian service, were earmarked for future deployment. Even converted civilian vessels, armed trawlers and minesweepers crewed by reservists, would play their role. None of these ships individually matched the firepower or speed of Japanese cruisers and destroyers, but collectively, they represented a force capable of dominating coastal waters and choke points where larger enemy vessels could not operate effectively. Training intensified as crews prepared for a different kind of warfare. The Atlantic had taught defensive thinking. Protect the convoy, depth charge the submarine, survive the faced crossing. Pacific operations would demand more aggressive tactics in support of American offensives island hopping toward Japan. Canadian crews practiced shore bombardment, learned to coordinate with aircraft they had rarely worked with, and studied Japanese tactics from intelligence reports and American combat experience. The reservists and volunteers who made up the bulk of the crews brought diverse skills from civilian life. Fishermen who could read water and weather, engineers who improvised repairs with whatever materials were available, and outdoorsmen comfortable with the cold that would become their greatest tactical advantage. By mid-1943, the frozen Navy was no longer a joke whispered in Japanese staff meetings, but a growing reality that Imperial headquarters had failed to adequately track. Canadian vessels began appearing in Aleutian waters, supporting American operations to reclaim islands seized by Japan in 1942. The frigid conditions that plagued Japanese garrison troops played perfectly to Canadian strengths. Ships designed to break through ice floes operated easily in waters where Japanese vessels suffered mechanical failures from cold. Crews trained in Atlantic gales navigated fog and storms that grounded enemy air reconnaissance. The underestimation persisted because Japanese intelligence remained focused on American fleet movements while dismissing Canadian contributions as negligible. That blindness would soon prove costly. The Aleutian Campaign provided the first real test of Canadian naval capabilities in the Pacific theater and revealed both the strengths of cold weather operations and the continued Japanese dismissal of northern threats. When American forces moved to retake Kiska and Attu Islands from Japanese occupation in 1943, Canadian vessels formed part of the naval screen, protecting invasion forces and supply lines. The Japanese garrison on Kiska received orders to hold at all costs, but their supply convoys faced an unexpected problem. Canadian corvettes and destroyers patrolling in conditions that would have sent tropical water vessels back to port. Fog banks that reduced visibility to nothing became hunting grounds for Canadian crews who had learned to operate by sound and radar in Atlantic convoy battles. Japanese submarine commanders attempting to interdict Allied supply lines discovered that the tactics perfecting in warm Pacific waters failed dramatically in northern seas. The cold water played havoc with torpedo performance, reducing range and reliability. Canadian escorts, already veterans of anti-submarine warfare from years of Atlantic duty, proved devastatingly effective at locating and attacking submarines that had grown overconfident from easier victories elsewhere. Several Japanese submarines dispatched to the Aleutians simply vanished, their fates unknown but likely ending in crushing depths or mechanical failure in the killing cold. The submarines that survived reported back that the northern approaches were far more dangerous than anticipated. But these warnings received little attention from commanders focused on battles further south. The evacuation of Kiska illustrated Japanese strategic thinking about the northern theater. Rather than sacrifice troops in a hopeless defense, Imperial headquarters authorized a daring evacuation under cover of fog in July 1943. The operation succeeded brilliantly, removing the entire garrison without Allied forces detecting the movement until soldiers landed on an empty island. Japanese planners celebrated this victory as proof of their superior tactics and night-fighting capabilities. What they failed to recognize was that their success stemmed entirely from avoiding combat with the naval forces blockading the island. The frozen Navy had effectively made resupply impossible, forcing the evacuation that Tokyo celebrated. The Canadians had won without firing a shot, but Japanese staff officers saw only their own cleverness rather than the cage that had trapped them. Canadian tactical innovations developed during these northern operations began spreading to other Allied forces. The practice of using small, maneuverable vessels in coastal waters, rather than risking larger ships in poorly charted northern seas, proved highly effective. Radar operators trained in picking out contacts through Atlantic storms found the relatively calmer Pacific conditions made their jobs easier, giving Canadian ships superior situational awareness. Engineering crews shared techniques for winterizing equipment and maintaining engines in extreme cold, knowledge desperately needed as Allied operations pushed northward. The institutional expertise built through years of operating in the harshest conditions was becoming a strategic asset that multiplied force effectiveness across the entire theater. As 1944 approached, Canadian naval planners looked beyond the Aleutians toward more ambitious operations. Intelligence reports suggested Japanese merchant shipping increasingly relied on northern routes to move resources from occupied territories back to the home islands, hoping to avoid American submarine concentrations further south. These northern lanes passed through waters Canadians understood intimately, fog-shrouded seas dotted with ice, where storms could appear in hours, and navigation demanded constant attention. The frozen Navy prepared to take the war directly to Japanese supply lines in the one environment where their expertise provided decisive advantage. The hunters were ready to become the hunted, but the prey remained convinced of their own superiority. The hunting grounds extended across the northern Pacific in vast stretches of gray water, where ice floes drifted like floating mines, and fog could swallow entire task forces without warning. Canadian corvettes and destroyers began aggressive patrols along suspected Japanese convoy routes in early 1944, operating sometimes hundreds of miles from support bases in conditions that tested both ships and men to their limits. The Japanese merchantmen attempting these northern passages had been assured by their naval escorts that enemy presence would be minimal, that the Americans remained focused on the Central Pacific Drive, and that no other Allied navy possessed the capability to threaten operations so far north. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong when Canadian vessels began emerging from fog banks to savage convoys with gunfire and torpedoes before disappearing again into the mist. The first major engagement came in the gray dawn of March 1944, when a Canadian destroyer group intercepted a Japanese convoy carrying critical raw materials from occupied Manchuria toward the home islands. The escorts, a pair of older destroyers considered adequate for what should have been a safe passage, found themselves facing opponents who knew these waters intimately. The Canadian vessels used fog banks for cover, appearing at close range, where their lighter guns negated the Japanese advantage in heavy armament. The engagement lasted less than 20 minutes but resulted in 3 merchantmen sinking and both escorts heavily damaged, limping away, trailing smoke while the Canadians withdrew intact. Japanese Naval Command received the report with disbelief bordering on fury, demanding to know how fishing boats crewed by amateurs had defeated trained warships. But the engagement was no fluke, and the pattern repeated with increasing frequency through the spring and summer. Canadian forces developed tactics specifically designed for northern warfare that played to every advantage the environment offered. They positioned ships near ice fields where the cold water created sonar dead zones, making submarine support for convoys nearly useless. They attacked during storms that grounded Japanese reconnaissance aircraft while Canadian radar operators tracked targets through weather that blinded optical rangefinders. Most devastatingly, they learned to drive damaged enemy vessels toward icebergs and ice fields, where the desperate ships would ground themselves or suffer hull damage that sent them to the bottom without the Canadians expending another shell. The ice itself became a weapon wielded by those who understood its patterns and movements. Japanese commanders responded by increasing escort strength and attempting to vary routes, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Their ships were designed for different conditions, their crews trained for different combat, and their doctrine built around assumptions that simply did not apply in northern waters. Engines optimized for tropical heat suffered reduced performance in freezing temperatures. Crews from southern Japan struggled with cold that their Canadian opponents had grown up with and trained in for years. Even basic seamanship became a liability when officers trained in Kure Naval Base tried to navigate waters more similar to the North Atlantic than anything in their experience. Every advantage that had made the Imperial Navy dominant in 1942 became worthless or worse in this frozen battlefield. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel began affecting operations across the entire northern theater. Convoy duty to northern ports became assignments dreaded by sailors who whispered about ghost ships appearing from nowhere to kill and vanish. Merchantmen requested transfers to southern routes even though American submarines made those passages equally dangerous. The frozen Navy had achieved something remarkable. They had created a zone of control through a combination of tactical excellence and environmental mastery that made an entire region effectively closed to Japanese operations. Yet still the laughter echoed from 1942. Still the reports filed by survivors were dismissed by senior commanders who could not accept that their contempt had blinded them to reality. The trap was closing, but pride prevented recognition until far too late. By autumn 1944, the cumulative losses from northern convoy operations had become impossible for Japanese logistics planners to ignore. Even as the naval staff continued dismissing Canadian capabilities as exaggerated, hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping had vanished in northern waters, critical raw materials never reaching factories that desperately needed them for war production. The losses compounded existing problems created by American submarine campaigns in southern waters, creating a noose that tightened around the Japanese war economy with every sunken merchantman. Imperial headquarters finally authorized a major operation to clear the northern sea lanes and destroy the frozen Navy once and for all, committing significant forces to what they expected would be a straightforward sweep against inferior opponents. The task force assembled for the operation represented substantial striking power, modern destroyers with experienced crews, supported by submarines, and covered by land-based aircraft from the Kuril Islands. Japanese planners studied the engagement reports they had previously dismissed, noting Canadian tactical patterns and attempting to devise countermeasures. They planned to use their speed advantage to force decisive engagements in clear weather, negating Canadian advantages in fog and storms. Submarines would establish picket lines to track enemy movements and vector surface forces to intercept. Aircraft would provide reconnaissance and attack any Canadian vessels spotted in open water. On paper, the plan appeared sound, overwhelming force applied to crush a minor opponent. Reality would prove different. The operation launched in October 1944 into weather that immediately began degrading Japanese advantages. A major storm system moved into the operational area, bringing exactly the conditions Canadians operated in routinely but that Japanese forces found crippling. Visibility dropped to near zero, aircraft remained grounded, and the submarine picket lines became useless as sonar conditions deteriorated. Canadian forces, tracking the Japanese task force through radio intercepts and radar, withdrew deliberately into ice fields, where their smaller ships could navigate channels that would tear open the hulls of larger Japanese destroyers. The hunters had become the hunted, but the terrain belonged entirely to the prey. What followed was less a battle than a nightmare for Japanese commanders who found every assumption overturned. Their ships blundered through fog, seeking an enemy who appeared at will to fire and vanish. Icebergs detected too late forced emergency maneuvers that scattered formations carefully planned in warm staff rooms. Two destroyers collided in near-zero visibility, both sustaining damage that forced them to withdraw. A submarine attempting to close on a Canadian corvette struck an underwater ice projection that crumpled its bow and sent it to the surface in desperate need of rescue. The Canadians, meanwhile, operated as if in home waters, their crews reading conditions instinctively and turning every environmental hazard into tactical advantage. They fired from concealment, withdrew through passages mapped by reconnaissance in previous patrols, and generally made fools of opponents who had expected easy victory. The operation collapsed after 4 days, when the Japanese task force commander, having lost 2 destroyers, sunk, and 3 more damaged, without achieving any significant Canadian casualties, ordered withdrawal back to base. The decision sparked furious debate at Imperial headquarters, where staff officers demanded explanations for how modern warships had been defeated by what they still insisted on calling a frozen navy of inferior vessels and amateur crews. The reports filed by surviving commanders painted a consistent picture. The Canadians fought with intimate knowledge of conditions that made Japanese advantages worthless, turning the environment itself into a weapon that no amount of courage or training could overcome. Finally, reluctantly, recognition began penetrating institutional denial. The frozen navy was not a joke, but a serious threat that had systematically dismantled Japanese northern operations through tactical superiority born of environmental mastery. The failed sweep operation marked a turning point in Japanese thinking about northern operations, but the shift came too late to salvage strategic position. High Command grudgingly acknowledged that Canadian forces controlled northern approaches effectively enough to make convoy operations prohibitively costly. Plans were drafted for improved cold weather training and equipment modifications to allow operations in conditions their ships were never designed for. Some officers argued for abandoning northern routes entirely, accepting that certain areas had simply become untenable for their forces. Others insisted that national pride demanded retaking control regardless of cost, that accepting Canadian dominance represented unacceptable defeat. While staff officers argued, Canadian vessels continued their methodical destruction of Japanese merchant traffic in waters that had become a private killing ground. The strategic implications rippled outward far beyond the tonnage sent to the bottom. Japanese industry increasingly struggled with raw material shortages as both southern routes fell to American submarines and northern routes became Canadian hunting grounds. The few convoys that did attempt northern passages required such heavy escorts that the naval resources consumed protecting merchantmen could not be deployed elsewhere. This defensive burden came precisely when Japanese forces desperately needed every available ship to counter American advances island hopping across the Pacific. The frozen navy had achieved strategic impact entirely disproportionate to its size, tying down resources and closing supply routes. Through mastery of one specific operational environment, Canadian success in the North inspired tactical innovations adopted by other Allied navies facing similar operational challenges. American forces began requesting Canadian liaison officers to teach cold weather operations as campaigns pushed toward the northern Japanese home islands. British forces preparing for potential Arctic convoy duty sought out veterans of Canadian Pacific operations to learn their techniques. The expertise built through years of Atlantic convoy battles, refined in northern Pacific combat, became intellectual capital that improved Allied naval effectiveness across multiple theaters. What began as a dismissed joke had become institutional knowledge valued throughout Allied naval commands. The human cost of northern operations weighed heavily, despite relatively light casualties compared to other theaters. The frozen navy operated in conditions that killed quickly when things went wrong, where a ship going down meant death in minutes, from hypothermia, for sailors in the water. Rescue operations in ice-filled seas and zero visibility tested courage and seamanship to absolute limits. Yet the volunteers who crewed Canadian vessels maintained effectiveness through the worst conditions imaginable, sustained by knowledge that their work strangled Japanese war economy and saved lives by ending the conflict sooner. They had proved themselves against an enemy that dismissed them as inferiors, winning respect paid in the grudging acknowledgement of Japanese officers who finally understood what they faced. By early 1945, Northern Pacific operations had settled into a grinding campaign of attrition that Japan could not win. Canadian vessels continued patrolling waters they had made their own, interdicting the trickle of Japanese shipping that still attempted northern routes. The dramatic engagements of 1944 gave way to routine blockade work, less glorious, but equally effective. Japanese naval forces avoided confrontation when possible, their earlier contempt replaced by healthy respect for opponents who had mastered warfare in conditions that remained alien to tropical water sailors. The trap had closed completely, and the frozen navy stood guard over its frozen domain, waiting for the war to end, while ensuring Japan received no relief from the north. The laughter from 1942 had long since died, replaced by grim recognition of underestimation's cost. The final months of the Pacific War demonstrated how completely Canadian control of northern waters had reshaped strategic calculations for both sides. American planners preparing for potential invasion of the Japanese home islands counted on northern approaches, remaining closed to enemy resupply, a guarantee provided entirely by Canadian naval presence. Intelligence assessments noted that Japanese forces in Manchuria and northern China could not reinforce the home islands because transport across northern waters had become suicidal. This isolation contributed to Japanese strategic paralysis, with major forces trapped on the Asian mainland, unable to influence decisive battles that would determine the war's outcome. Analysis of Japanese logistics reveals catastrophic impact from Canadian northern operations combined with American submarine warfare elsewhere. Rice supplies from Southeast Asia, oil from the Dutch East Indies, steel from Manchuria, all critical resources fueling Japanese war industry, were either cut off entirely or reduced to trickles. The northern routes that Canadian forces controlled had represented Japan's last hope for moving bulk cargo with reasonable expectation of arrival. When those routes closed, the economic noose became terminal. Post-war studies would suggest logistics collapse contributed as much to Japanese surrender as battlefield defeats, and Canadian operations figured prominently in that collapse. The human dimension of northern warfare left lasting impressions on those who experienced it. Canadian sailors who survived these operations returned home, changed by months or years, operating in conditions that tested human endurance daily. They had lived with cold that froze breath and made metal dangerous to touch, fought battles in zero visibility where skill and luck determined survival, and maintained equipment in conditions designed to destroy machinery. Many struggled to articulate experiences to families who had no reference for the specific challenges of northern warfare. Japanese personnel who survived encounters with Canadian forces carried equally powerful memories, shadowed by humiliation of defeat by an enemy they had been taught to despise. Officers who lost ships or watched convoys slaughtered struggled with shame compounded by knowledge that their own leadership's contempt had contributed to disaster. Sailors who experienced combat in northern waters developed visceral hatred for the cold that made them vulnerable and fog that concealed enemies, until too late. Some wrote privately about psychological impact of fighting opponents who seemed to command nature itself. Recognition of Canadian contributions to Pacific victory came slowly and incompletely in the post-war period. The frozen Navy's operations never captured public imagination the way carrier battles did, in part because effective blockade is inherently less dramatic than decisive battles. Canadian crews received relatively little attention as nations focused on rebuilding, and veterans returned to civilian life. Only decades later would historians fully appreciate how northern operations contributed to Japanese defeat by closing supply routes and tying down resources. The lessons learned from Canadian northern operations influenced post-war naval thinking in ways extending far beyond specific circumstances of Pacific warfare. Cold weather operations doctrine developed through brutal trial and error became standard curriculum at naval training facilities preparing for potential conflict in Arctic and subarctic regions. Equipment design incorporated features proven essential by Canadian experience. Improved winterization systems, specialized radar adapted for ice and fog, hull designs that could handle ice without catastrophic damage. The frozen Navy's tactics entered case studies, teaching how environmental mastery could overcome material disadvantage. Geopolitical calculations during the emerging Cold War gave Canadian northern expertise renewed strategic importance. The Arctic became potential front line between NATO and Soviet forces, with sea lanes and air routes crossing frozen waters where Canadian experience provided critical advantages. Naval planners recognized that lessons from Pacific operations applied directly to potential Arctic convoy protection missions and northern patrol duties. Veterans of the frozen Navy found themselves called back to teach new generations, their hard-won knowledge suddenly relevant again. The psychological aspects of Canadian success merited attention from military theorists, studying how underestimation affects combat outcomes. Japanese dismissal of Canadian capabilities stemmed from cultural prejudice, reinforced by early war victories that bred dangerous overconfidence. This pattern repeated throughout military history when dominant powers faced opponents they deemed inferior, only to suffer defeats rooted in failing to accurately assess enemy capabilities. Canadian operations provided clear example of how environmental adaptation and tactical innovation could trump material advantages when combined with opponent contempt that prevented realistic evaluation. The transformation of Canadian national identity included assimilation of naval achievements into collective memory, though this process unfolded unevenly. The Army's contributions in Italy and Northwest Europe dominated Canadian war narratives, with Navy receiving less attention in popular consciousness. Veterans of the frozen Navy sometimes felt their service went unrecognized compared to those who fought in more publicized campaigns. Historians gradually corrected this imbalance as archival research revealed the scope and impact of northern operations. The broader significance of Canadian northern operations lay in demonstration that smaller nations with specialized capabilities could make disproportionate strategic contributions in coalition warfare. Canada never possessed massive battle fleets or carrier task forces that dominated naval warfare, but carved out a role where geography and expertise provided advantages. This model influenced Canadian defense policy throughout the Cold War and beyond, emphasizing development of niche capabilities that provided value to alliance partners. The frozen Navy established a template: identify operational environments where national advantages exist and leveraged specialization to achieve strategic impact beyond what raw force size would suggest possible. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the frozen navy had effectively ceased major combat operations, but remained at station in northern waters, maintaining the blockade that had proven so effective. Canadian vessels patrolled through the final days of war, intercepting last desperate attempts to move cargo between mainland and home islands, ensuring isolation remained complete until the very end. The surrender itself came as relief to crews who had spent years operating in brutal conditions, yet also brought strange sense of anticlimax. There were no dramatic final battles, no spectacular victories to mark the end, only gradual winding down of patrol duties and the long journey home. The return to Canada brought mixed receptions for veterans of Pacific operations. Public attention focused overwhelmingly on return of Army units that had fought in Europe, whose campaigns had been extensively covered by media throughout the war. Navy personnel arriving from Pacific stations found themselves largely anonymous, their service acknowledged but not celebrated with enthusiasm greeting other units. Some found this lack of recognition frustrating after years of dangerous service in obscurity. Others appreciated the ability to resume civilian lives without a tension that made readjustment difficult for more publicized veterans. The institutional legacy within the Royal Canadian Navy proved more substantial than public recognition. The service had grown from token force in 1939 to significant Navy by 1945, gaining operational experience and institutional confidence that reshaped Canadian naval identity. Officers who commanded vessels in northern operations rose through post-war ranks carrying lessons learned from combat. Doctrine manuals incorporated tactics proven in northern waters. The Navy that emerged from war knew itself capable of operations far more demanding than pre-war assumptions had suggested possible. International naval communities slowly recognized Canadian contributions as post-war assessments compiled comprehensive accounts of Pacific operations. American official histories acknowledged Canadian role in securing northern approaches and interdicting Japanese supply lines. British naval analysts studying cold weather operations referenced Canadian experiences extensively. Japanese naval officers writing memoirs sometimes mentioned northern disasters with rueful acknowledgement that they had been systematically outfought in conditions they never adequately prepared for. Personal reconciliation with wartime service followed varied paths for individual veterans. Some spoke openly about northern operations, finding audiences in veterans' organizations. Others remained silent, finding experiences too difficult to articulate or simply choosing to move forward without dwelling on the past. A few struggled with what they witnessed and done, carrying psychological burdens that post-war society had few resources to address. The generation that crewed Canadian vessels through northern waters gradually aged, their ranks thinning year by year, their memories becoming history as living connection to events faded. The final assessment of Canadian northern naval operations requires balancing strategic impact against resource investment and comparing outcomes to alternatives. Canada committed relatively modest naval forces to Pacific operations, never more than a few dozen vessels even at peak strength. Yet these forces controlled vast areas of ocean, closed critical supply routes, and tied down Japanese resources disproportionate to their size. The return on investment measured in strategic terms proved exceptional, demonstrating how specialized capabilities employed in appropriate operational environments could achieve effects far exceeding what force size alone would suggest. The human cost measured against other campaigns remained relatively light in absolute terms, though no less real for those who paid it. Canadian Pacific operations lost several vessels to enemy action and weather, with casualties numbering in hundreds rather than thousands common in other theaters. Every death mattered to families and comrades, but compared to bloodbaths elsewhere, northern operations were mercifully less costly. This lower casualty rate reflected both the nature of naval warfare, where engagements were brief and decisive, and Canadian tactical superiority that allowed them to dictate terms of engagement. The enduring lesson from Canadian northern operations transcended specific tactical or strategic details to address fundamental questions about military effectiveness and sources of combat power. Material superiority matters greatly, but environmental mastery and tactical adaptation can overcome significant disadvantages in force structure and equipment. Cultural contempt and institutional arrogance create vulnerabilities that competent opponents exploit ruthlessly. Small nations with specialized capabilities can contribute meaningfully to coalition efforts when they identify and develop advantages that larger partners lack. The story of the frozen Navy deserves remembrance not for nationalist glorification, but as testament to what ordinary people achieved when challenged by circumstances demanding extraordinary effort. The sailors who crewed Canadian vessels in northern waters were volunteers and reservists, fishermen and farmers and shopkeepers who learned to fight in conditions testing human endurance daily. They transformed contempt into respect through competent performance under brutal conditions. They contributed to Allied victory, while remaining largely invisible to contemporary observers, focused on more dramatic campaigns. The laughter that Japanese commanders voiced in 1942 when first encountering reports of Canadian naval capabilities was born of prejudice and ignorance, assumptions that superior technology and training would overcome any opposition. Reality taught different. Lessons written in sunken ships and closed supply routes, in icebergs that became traps, and fog that concealed hunters. The frozen Navy proved that expertise built through necessity, applied with intelligence and courage, could defeat opponents who underestimated what cold water and determined sailors could accomplish together. The joke had turned deadly serious, and by war's end, no one was laughing anymore.